31 states have active legislation targeting survival preparations that were completely uncontested a decade ago. Not fringe stuff, not anything exotic. We're talking about catching rain off your own roof, storing seeds from your own harvest, drilling into the ground beneath land you legally own. Things your grandfather did without a permit, a variance, or a knock on the door, and nobody thought twice about it. Here's what nobody says out loud. The infrastructure that turns free citizens into dependent ones doesn't arrive with jackboots. It arrives with zoning amendments, building code updates, watershed protection acts. Incremental, bureaucratic, boring enough that most people scroll past the headline. That is not an accident. That is the design. This video covers 7 preparations getting quietly strangled by law in 2026. Some are already banned outright in specific states. Others are in the regulatory chokehold right now, legal today, permitted to death by next year. All of them share one characteristic. They reduce your dependence on systems that can fail. That is not a coincidence. I need you to understand that before we start. 3 filters. That's how we built this list. First, enforcement trend. Is the restriction expanding or contracting? A regulation that loses in court and gets rolled back doesn't make the list. We need momentum, not noise. Second, visibility. How detectable is this prep at the residential level? Preparations that are invisible to satellites, permit records, and code databases get treated differently than ones you can see from the street. Third, irreversibility. If they restrict this, can you rebuild the capability after collapse? Or is that window permanently closed? That third filter is the one that kept me up, because the most dangerous restrictions aren't the ones that stop you from doing something today. They're the ones that close the door on capability you'll desperately need when the grid goes quiet and every agency enforcing these rules is nowhere to be found. That's the filter that determines where something lands on this list. 7 items. Countdown structure. We start at the bottom and work toward the one that, in my opinion, changes the calculus for every serious prepper watching this. First tier, the monitored. Items 7 through 5. These are the preparations where the regulatory infrastructure is real, enforcement is inconsistent, and the trend lines are moving the wrong direction. They're not in crisis yet, they're in the early stages of a process that ends somewhere you don't want to be. Number 7. Rainwater collection, the sky tax. Most people assume rainwater collection is a settled fight. It feels too basic to regulate. You're catching water that fell on your property from the sky. What kind of government tells you that's not yours? Colorado's government? For most of the last century. Utah's until 2010. Washington State, where collection is technically legal, but strict per household limits apply. And you'd better read the fine print before you touch that downspout. The underlying legal theory is prior appropriation doctrine, the idea that water rights are allocated like property, and the rain that hits your roof is technically already owned by downstream rights holders before it touches your shingles. That sounds insane. It is also actual law, actively enforced. The mechanism. In a prior appropriation state, water rights are senior and junior, first in time, first in right. That doctrine was originally designed for rivers and aquifers. Legal interpretation extended it to precipitation in some jurisdictions. Catch that water before it runs off into the watershed, and, theoretically, you're intercepting something already spoken for. The legal fiction is that your rain barrel is stealing from a rancher 3 counties downstream, whose water rights predate your property by 60 years. Colorado legalized limited residential collection in 2016. Keyword, limited 255-gallon barrels, 110 gallons total. Your average American burns through about 80 gallons a day. That's roughly 1 day's supply. On a short shower, no laundry kind of day for a single person. For a family of 4, it's a rounding error. Here's the catch that disappears from the rainwater's now legal headlines. The trend is toward registration, not toward freedom. Utah requires permits for systems over 2,500 gallons. Oregon has enforcement mechanisms for unpermitted collection. The trajectory is toward a documented, registered, monitored system, which works fine until the registering authority decides your barrel configuration is non-compliant with the updated 2026 guidelines you never saw. This item makes the list because it reveals how the playbook works. Something natural and obvious gets regulated through an obscure legal doctrine most people have never heard of. That is the template. Remember it. Number 6. Seed saving and heirloom seed libraries. The quiet patent war. Nobody thinks of seeds as contraband. That is the point. Walk into a seed library, the kind embedded in public libraries in Vermont, Oregon, California, 40 other states, and you can check out tomato seeds, the way you check out a paperback thriller. Return seeds from your harvest at the end of the season. It's elegant. It's community food resilience in a shoebox. The pressure comes from 2 directions simultaneously. First, state agriculture departments increasingly require seed libraries to comply with commercial seed regulations, germination rate testing, Labeling requirements, variety certification. Variety certification. Indiana tried to shut down seed libraries entirely in 2014 under commercial seed dealer statutes before a public backlash forced them to back off. The regulatory framework designed for industrial agriculture gets applied to a box of envelopes in a library lobby, and the compliance costs that make sense for a multinational are existential for a volunteer operation running on donated mason jars. Second direction, and this one's more insidious, variety protection. The Plant Variety Protection Act allows patent-like protection on seed varieties for up to 25 years. Saved seed from a protected variety can constitute infringement, and the line between protected commercial hybrids and true open-pollinated heirlooms is getting blurry as large seed companies quietly acquire small heirloom seed banks. Your grandmother's tomato variety is probably fine. The heirloom you bought last season from a brand that got acquired 18 months ago? Read the fine print. Actually read it. Here's the survival mechanism that makes this critical. Hybrid varieties, which dominate the commercial seed market because they produce consistent, predictable yields for single-season agriculture, do not breed true. Save seed from a hybrid tomato, plant it next year, and what grows is genetically scrambled. That is not a bug. That is the feature that locks farmers into purchasing new seed every single year. Heirloom varieties, the ones that breed true across generations, are the category facing the most regulatory pressure. Let that connection sink in. Number 5. Amateur radio emergency communications? The spectrum squeeze. Here's where people usually push back. Amateur radio has federal protection. The FCC licenses it. The ARRL has been defending spectrum rights since 1914. What's the actual threat? The threat is spectrum, and it's moving fast and quiet, the way things move when there's money involved. FCC spectrum auctions from 2021 through 2024 transferred significant UHF band space to commercial carriers for 5G deployment. The process involves what the FCC politely calls clearing incumbent users, including amateur radio operators, get relocated to different frequencies or absorb interference from commercial infrastructure moving in next door. The technical language is perfectly neutral. The practical effect is that emergency communications networks built by amateur radio operators over decades, repeater systems, linked mesh networks, regional coordination infrastructure, faces degradation or forced migration as commercial towers go up around them. The equipment that worked flawlessly last year starts experiencing problems that are real, technically documentable, and very difficult to fight. The other pressure is on the licensing pipeline itself. The FCC's modernization initiatives have included proposals changing examination requirements, fee structures, and operating privileges. Nothing catastrophic has fully passed yet, but the direction of travel is toward administrative friction for a community that currently self-administers its own licensing through volunteer exam teams, a remarkably efficient system that functions because the bureaucratic overhead is low, and a volunteer-run system starts to collapse under its own weight. The amateur radio operator base already skews older and is facing a succession problem. It doesn't need more friction. It's getting more friction. The survival relevance is precise. In a grid-down scenario, amateur radio is how you talk to people more than 30 miles away without infrastructure. It's how you find out if the thing that hit your region is regional or national. The capability requires years to build, licensed, equipped, networked, and cannot be improvised after collapse. The window to establish it is now. The catch enforcement pressure today is on infrastructure and spectrum, not on individual operators. If you're not licensed, the cost of that delay is rising. Step up. The next tier changes the tone. Everything from here forward is not monitored. It's targeted. Enforcement is operational. Legal challenges have been mostly unsuccessful. These are the preparations where the machinery is already running against you. Second tier, the actively targeted. Items 4 and 3. These are the preparations where code enforcement is real. The legal mechanisms are deployed, and the personal stakes get significantly higher. Number 4. Urban livestock and food-producing gardens. The permitted-to-death strategy. Most people think backyard chickens are legal now. And in a lot of places, they are, with permits, with flock limits, with setback requirements from property lines, with neighbor notification processes, with annual inspection fees, and with roosters categorically banned because a rooster at 4 a.m. is a noise complaint with feathers. Technically legal, practically buried in compliance paperwork. What's actually happening is a two-track system. Progressive municipalities legalized chickens through ordinance reform in the 2010. But the permitting architecture that enables that legalization also creates the mechanism for revocation. When suburban density increases, when new neighbors arrive from places where chickens are not a concept, when HOA influence bleeds into municipal code, the permit that was granted gets reviewed. The ordinance gets amended. What was legal Thursday is non-conforming Monday after the council vote. California is the case study. Los Angeles permits chickens up to specific flock sizes. Multiple incorporated cities within LA County Separate jurisdictions, separate codes, same geographic area, have banned them outright. The patchwork is so dense that compliance is practically impossible to track without researching your specific parcel's jurisdiction at the county assessor level. Not the ZIP code, the parcel. Because the ZIP code answer and the legal answer are often different. Here's what this does to the math. A backyard flock of 6 hens produces 3 to 4 eggs per day. 25 eggs per week, enough to cover a family's protein baseline with margin. It's not glamorous in a disruption scenario where commercial supply chains have hiccuped. And they will. It's the difference between breakfast and not breakfast. The municipalities regulating this out of existence are not running a survivability analysis. They're managing aesthetics and neighbor complaints. Survivability is not in their mandate. Food forest ordinances are the other front. Several jurisdictions have used property maintenance codes, written to prevent yards from becoming actual jungles, which is a reasonable goal, to cite homeowners for front yard food gardens. In Tulsa, in Miami-Dade, and Tulsa, in Miami-Dade, in various Michigan municipalities. Recorded enforcement actions against productive landscapes that violated neat and orderly standards, written for decorative lawns. The code was designed for one thing. It gets used for another. The regulatory mechanism doesn't care about the original intent. The catch is genuine. Enforcement is locally variable in ways that make national generalizations nearly useless. Your county might be entirely fine. Your neighbor's county, same state, completely different outcome. The research burden falls entirely on you, and the stakes are not abstract. If you get cited and don't comply, you're not just paying a fine, you're dismantling the food infrastructure you spent years building. Let me stop here for a second because I know what some of you are thinking. This sounds like a list of edge cases, a seed library in Indiana, a chicken in Tulsa, a 19th century water rights doctrine, theoretical, niche. Not really connected, it is absolutely connected. The common thread through every item on this list is not incompetence, and it is not conspiracy, it is dependency architecture. Every restriction makes the regulated activity harder to perform without a licensed professional, a permitted infrastructure, or a utility connection you don't control. Every friction point is a point where the independent actor gets channeled back toward the dependent one. That's not paranoia, that's systems analysis. The system has a direction. The direction is toward dependency. That's where the money is, that's where the regulatory capture is, and that is precisely where you don't want to be when the money stops working. Understand the pattern. Now we continue. Number 3, off-grid water systems, the well you can't legally dig. Forget the romantic image of drilling your own well on your own land. We're past that. The average cost of drilling a residential well in the United States right now is $15,000 to $30,000 depending on depth and geology. That number has increased 60% in 4 years due to supply chain pressure on rig availability and steel casing. That's economics, not regulation. Here's the regulation. 37 states require a licensed contractor to drill residential wells. You cannot legally drill your own well on your own property in most of the United States. Let that settle. You own the land. The water is under it. You cannot reach it without a licensed professional, a permit, and in many states a waiting period for permit approval that averages 6 to 18 months. 6 to 18 months. The permit requirement exists because aquifer management is genuinely real. Unregulated drilling can damage shared groundwater, introduce contamination pathways, cause subsidence. The mechanism is legitimate. The problem is that a 6-month wait in peacetime becomes an insurmountable barrier after an event that disrupts normal commerce. The licensed contractor who could drill your well in 2025 might not be operating in 2027. The permit office might not be functional. The steel casing supply chain might be disrupted. The window to establish water independence is narrow and getting narrower, and you can't do it yourself even if you have the skills and the equipment. Because the law says you can't. Is regulated under surface water or groundwater statutes depending on whether the spring is considered a tributary of something larger. In many cases, the answer is the spring running through your property is not yours to collect without authorization, because it may be considered a water of the state, a shared resource held in public trust, even if the only place it surfaces is your land. Missouri, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho have all had enforcement actions against rural landowners who assumed the spring on their property was their water. Here's the mechanism, because it's worth understanding. Groundwater and surface water are hydrologically connected. They are not separate systems. A spring fed by an aquifer that crosses multiple properties is legally a shared resource regardless of where it surfaces. The state acts as trustee. The hydrological logic is sound, applied to a homesteader trying to water a garden from a sea producing 2 gallons a minute. It's regulatory machinery operating at a scale wildly disproportionate to the resource, creating real legal exposure for the exact kind of small-scale independent operation this list is about. Here's the statistic that will genuinely ruin your day. The EPA estimates approximately 43 million Americans currently get water from private wells. Regulatory pressure on new well permitting means that number is effectively capped. The existing wells continue. The pathway to joining that group, if you're not already in it, is getting longer, more expensive, and more gate-kept every year. Water independence is becoming a legacy privilege, something you have if your family was already there, not something you can build from scratch. Water is the foundation of everything else. Every other preparation, food production, power generation, medical capability, assumes water. Without it, the timeline is 72 hours. The preparations that close off water independence don't look dramatic. A permit requirement, a contractor licensing law, a 6-month queue. The compound effect is a population that cannot establish water independence on owned land, because the regulatory path to doing so has been made practically inaccessible. Not formally banned, just practically impossible for most people. Now we're in the final tier, the existence set of restrictions. 2 items. I've been calling them that not because the other 5 don't matter, but because these are the preparations where the capability once lost cannot be reconstructed within a realistic time frame after an event. These are the ones that change what's possible for the next decade, not just next year. The holy grails. The final 2. Everything from here is the thesis. Number 2. Solar and off-grid energy systems. The mandated connection. This one requires me to separate what's real from what's overblown, because both sides of this debate usually get it wrong in opposite directions. Residential solar is not being banned. That's not the story. Net metering, the system where your panels produce excess power and your utility credits you for selling it back, is being systematically dismantled in the states where solar adoption is highest. And watch solar installations collapse by 76% in a single year. California's NEM 3.0, implemented in 2020, reduced export compensation rates by roughly 75% compared to the previous structure. The financial model that made residential solar economically viable in the state with the most solar installations in the country was effectively ended in 18 months. That's the grid-tied system. Here's the survival-relevant story. Truly off-grid solar systems not connected to the utility at all faces a regulatory environment that most people don't know exists. Many jurisdictions require residential structures to maintain a grid connection as a condition of occupancy permits. You want to legally live in a house, the house must be connected to the utility. Not optional, mandatory. You cannot legally occupy a properly permitted residential structure in those jurisdictions while running it exclusively on independent solar battery power. The utility hookup is a code requirement, treated as a safety feature, roughly equivalent to requiring a smoke detector or a handrail and emergency access. The effect is that true energy independence is legally prohibited as a primary residential energy source in those jurisdictions, regardless of whether your solar battery system is technically superior in every measurable way to the grid connection it's replacing. Here's the mechanism on why this matters beyond the obvious. Energy is the multiplier. Every other survival preparation on this list runs on energy. Water pumping, food preservation, communications, medical equipment, light, heat. A home with reliable independent power generation has options that a home without it simply does not have. And those options compound during the exact disruption scenarios where they matter most. The regulatory architecture closing off that independence isn't happening through dramatic prohibition. It's happening through building codes requiring grid connection, utility interconnection requirements, HOA covenants prohibiting visible solar installations, and permit requirements for battery storage systems that add months and thousands of dollars to every installation. Montana, Florida, and Texas have passed solar rights laws protecting homeowners from HOA prohibition of panels. That's real progress. It doesn't touch the building code mandated grid connection requirement. The panel on your roof can be protected by state law. The decision to cut the grid entirely can still be prohibited by the same building code your county adopted 3 years ago. The catch, if you're in a rural area with no HOA and permissive county codes, most of this doesn't apply to you today. The regulatory pressure is concentrated in dense suburban and urban areas, exactly where the most people live, exactly where energy independence would matter most in a sustained disruption, and exactly where the people who need this capability most are most restricted from having it. Let that settle. Now, the number 1 item, the preparation that sits at the intersection of every single item on this list, the one that combines water rights, energy independence, food production, communications, and legal residence into a single target, the one being dismantled, not through headline-making legislation, but through building codes and land use law and minimum habitation standards that most people have never read and wouldn't believe if they did. Number 1, the right to self-sufficient homesteading, the legal architecture of dependence. Here's the sentence that changes the calculus for everything on this list. In most American counties, you cannot legally occupy a structure that doesn't meet minimum habitation standards, and those standards were written by a building code apparatus that assumes grid connection, municipal water, municipal sewage, and minimum square footage that makes small footprint self-sufficient living legally impossible in a permitted structure. Not hard, not expensive, legally impossible to permit as your primary residence. The minimum habitation standards that dictate what you're allowed to live in were codified primarily through the International Residential Code and its state-level adoptions. Habitable room of 70 square feet, minimum ceiling heights of 7 feet. Permanent heat sources meeting utility infrastructure standards, sanitation systems, meeting septic or municipal sewer code, and electrical systems meeting NEC requirements, which in most jurisdictions means grid-connected or with a utility-approved disconnect. A structure meeting none of these requirements can be built. You just can't legally live in it as your primary residence. There is a legal distinction between a structure you own and a dwelling you're allowed to inhabit. Most people don't know that distinction exists until they try to cross it. Walk with me through what this means in practice. You buy 5 acres in a rural county. You want to build a small, efficient, self-sufficient homestead, solar power, rainwater collection, composting septic, minimal footprint. You have the money, you have the knowledge, you have legal title to the land. You go to the county building department for a permit. It's so technically complex and so expensive that it functions as a prohibition even when it isn't formally one. Environmental impact studies for non-standard septic systems run $10,000 to $20,000. Building department review for structures that don't follow conventional IRC patterns can take years, not months, years. Because the officials reviewing your application don't have a code pathway for what you're building. They default to denial, requiring variances, which require hearings, which require attorneys, which cost money, which creates delay, which means you're waiting with land you're paying taxes on, but can't legally use the way you intended to. The system doesn't have to formally say no. It just has to make yes take long enough and cost enough that most people give up. The tiny home movement thought it found a workaround through ADU liberalization, accessory dwelling units. Secondary structures on residential properties were streamlined in California, Oregon, and several other states starting around 2020. That was real reform. Except the reform was specifically designed to address urban housing density, and the structures it liberalized are still subject to minimum habitation standards, utility connection requirements, and the same code apparatus that makes self-sufficient construction legally fraught. The ADU law that made it easier to build a backyard apartment in Sacramento didn't change what you're allowed to do with that apartment in terms of how it's powered and watered. Here's where all 7 items on this list converge, because I need you to see this as a system, not a list. A self-sufficient homestead requires water independence, which faces well permit restrictions and contractor licensing requirements. It requires energy independence, which faces grid connection mandates. It requires food production, which faces urban livestock ordinances and garden aesthetics codes. It requires communications infrastructure, which faces spectrum pressure. It requires seed independence, which faces variety protection and commercial seed regulations applied to private exchange. It requires water collection, which faces prior appropriation doctrine. Every single item on this list is, individually, a restriction on one layer of self-sufficiency. Item 1 is the restriction on self-sufficiency itself. The legal architecture that requires you to connect to every system you're trying to be independent of the architecture that makes dependence the default and independence the exception that requires proving your case. The data, the American Institute for Economic Research analyzed zoning and building codes across 300 counties and found that fewer than 15% allowed genuinely self-sufficient residential developments, solar-only, well-water, alternative septic, small footprint without requiring variances or code exceptions. 15%. In a country where land ownership is supposed to imply the right to use that land, the trend line is moving against that 15%. Metropolitan counties are exporting their building codes to rural areas through state-level code adoption requirements. States that previously allowed counties to set their own building standards, giving rural counties the freedom to permit non-standard construction, are standardizing toward the International Residential Code. The rural exception that made homesteading legally accessible is shrinking, quietly, through state legislative sessions that don't make national news. Here's the mechanism on why this happens, and why it is not a coordinated conspiracy, but something far harder to fight. Building codes create contractor licensing requirements. Contractor licensing requirements create trade associations. Trade associations lobby for building codes that require licensed contractors. The cycle is self-reinforcing and requires no coordinated intent to produce its effect. The building code apparatus was not designed to eliminate homesteading. It just happens to eliminate homesteading as a side effect of a system built around conventional construction in conventional contexts. Intent doesn't matter when you're standing in front of a building department that can't issue you a permit, because no pathway exists for what you're trying to build. What do you do with this? Research your specific county code before you buy land. Not the state code, not the regional code, the county code, the township code, the HOA covenants, if any exist within 5 miles. The patchwork is real, and the answer in your zip code is often completely different from the answer 10 miles down the road. The 15% of counties that still permit genuine self-sufficient development cluster in specific regions, parts of Appalachia, parts of the rural Mountain West, parts of the Ozarks, scattered pockets of the upper Midwest, and knowing where those counties are before you spend money on land that won't let you do what you bought it for is the most valuable research you can do in the next 6 months. Start the permit clock on your water now. The 6-month wait on a well permit is not an exaggeration. The pathway to legal water independence is longer than almost everyone assumes, and it does not get shorter after an event that disrupts the agencies processing those permits. And understand that the restrictions on this list are not the end of the story. They are the current chapter. Restrictions expand when populations become dependent. Populations become dependent when the infrastructure of independence is regulated out of reach. The people writing these codes are not survivalists. They are not running calculations about what happens when the systems these codes assume, grid power, municipal water, commercial food supply, stop working. That failure of imagination is not your problem to fix. Your problem is to build capability while the window remains open, because the window is not standing still. 7 preparations. 1 trend. The systems you depend on are building walls around the exits. The window to establish water independence, energy independence, food production capacity is open right now, not wide open, narrowing measurably every year. Your grandfather didn't need permission to be self-sufficient on his own land. You do. Get those permissions while the process still works. The people who will be fine are the ones who built the infrastructure before they needed it. That is either you or it isn't.